Hello everyone, my name is Michael Wanjiro, and today I'll be looking at Edgar Allan Poe, a writer. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts to Elizabeth and David Poe. The parents were actors in theater in the East Coast cities of Boston and North Carolina, or rather from Boston to North Carolina. And when Edgar was very young, David, the father, abandoned the family, and the mother continued to support the family as an actress, and she continued to work in theater. And because of the family's circumstances, she would have to take Poe to work every day. And since she was acting mostly in the play Romeo and Juliet, and as many of you might know, is that the last scene of Romeo and Juliet features Juliet being stabbed. And as a young child and as a young mind, Poe absorbed these horror scenes over and over and over, seeing the mother being, pretend killed every night. And then later on, the mother died when Poe was only about 4 years old. And these horror scenes, must have scarred Poe, while he was very, very young. And I do believe it had a profound effect on his writing later on. As we see, he is the master of the dark literature. So anyway, after Poe's parents had, been removed from the scene, he was taken in by foster parents who really did not adopt him, but their names were John and Frances Allan. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these are the only available images of Poe's parents, David Poe on the left and Elizabeth Poe on the right. John and Frances Allan were a rich family. They were merchants from Virginia, and at some point John decided to move his family to England, and while there Poe attended a school where it was an interesting school, and the headmaster was at best very weird. For example, some of the things he would do, he would force the students to help out at the local cemetery, like digging graves so they could get their physical education class credits. You can imagine that, like you're going to school and the principal says, to get your PE credits, you go help the grave diggers, inter remains, and he would also require them to calculate the ages of dead people from the inscriptions of the tombstones for maths class, which it is pretty, nerve-wracking. But I mean, Poe went through these things at a very young age, and he also lost a lot of family members. There were many tragedies where people would die of what would be known as the consumption back then, and what we call tuberculosis today. And so he grew up surrounded by a lot of tragedy and grief. And my impression is that even though Poe was a brilliant mind, his life experiences inspired his writing. He is known today as one of the best American authors. He is a big pop fiction icon. He is the brains behind the creation of such genres as the gothic tale, horror, the detective story, and science fiction. And I have a little comic strip showing an image of Poe with a raven on his shoulder. It says, "I'm just a poor boy and nobody loves me," which pretty much sums up his life story, and the raven seems to agree. So anyway, today we are going to be looking at one of his short stories. It's a horror story. It's a murder story called The Telltale Heart. And I'll go over the summary and then we'll look at the interpretation. So anyway, in the short story, The Telltale Heart, the story is of an unknown narrator who has committed a murder and seeks to justify it to the readers or to someone with whom he's talking. The narrator seeks to convince us that he is not insane, but nervous. At the beginning, it says, and I'll quote, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and I am. But why will you say that I'm mad?" So this guy is disturbed by the pale blue eye of an old man who lives in the same neighborhood as he does. He claims it's hard to look at it. So every night for a week, he sneaks into the old man's bedroom, and on the 8th day, he eventually kills him. He eventually kills him and then dismembers his body and hides it under the house, and then puts back the planks of the floor, and then cleans up the murder scene. But I think a neighbor heard a shout when he was killing him, and the police come down to investigate. But the narrator is careful not to reveal his misdeed at first. But by the end of the story, he confesses to the murder, or he confesses the murder to the police, who have come to investigate. And he does this in a casual and measured and careful way, not to appear as insane. In fact, one of the main things with this story is that this narrator is trying very, very hard to appear as not insane. That he ends up, confessing to the actual crime. But he's more worried about appearing not insane than actually being nailed for the crime. So eventually he confesses at the end of the story. So for the interpretation, we'll look at the main theme, or, what is the main idea behind the story. I believe the main idea here is the consequence of guilt on the human conscience. We can probably look at some of the words of the narrator in the story. I think when Poe writes the story, it captures this conversation that had been taking place long before we, as the readers, are brought onto the scene. And so, seeing that he agreed at first that he is indeed nervous, maybe to a detective who was investigating the issue, or maybe to someone else long after the event had passed, maybe even a fellow prisoner. But anyway, the idea of a guilty conscience haunting him is evidenced throughout the story, that he would go at such great length to justify his crime against the old man, who, by the way, he admits that he didn't have any ill will towards, and in fact, he says he loved him. So this shows that he is really desperate to appear reasonable in his actions and minimize the weight of his guilt. And from the argument that the narrator makes of experiencing a nervous disease and his hope that this proves his innocence, it's really ironical, And we read where he says, "I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad?" And this description of his motivation for the events that lead to the murder actually show that he is indeed insane to me, So some of the things he says in support of his claims are not things that we would ordinarily associate with a sane person. For example, this quotation, I do not believe normal people cannot say those types of things, In my opinion, this contention that he would be so disturbed by a mere eye, just like somebody's eye, and there is no other motive to the point of killing the old man, is proof of his madness. And really, on top of that, the guilt, that is gnawing on him. So the whole line of his argument actually proves his guilt. In an exposition of the short story by E. Arthur Robinson, who is a professor of English at the University of Rhode Island, and I quote, it specifically, the narrator bases his plea upon the assumption that madness is incompatible with systemic action, and as evidence for his capacity for the latter, he relates how he has executed a horrible crime with rational precision. Pardon my reading on the screen, but I needed to capture that because this really sums up one of the themes, that this guy is really trying hard to appear as sane, but he ends up proving that he did the crime, and while at it, shows us that he is indeed insane, and so that is very interesting. The other thing that we see in the story is that the narrator dehumanizes the old man in order to make it easier for him to commit the crime. Because as long as the old man is not who he was targeting, but a certain evil eye that has done a lot of harm, to him, that is by terrorizing him, then it is a just deed to kill him, because he wouldn't really be killing the old man, he would be getting rid of the evil eye. And as you can see, that there's a quote, "For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye." So he really tries hard to dehumanize the old man and make it about the eye. So that is another theme, or like another way that Poe, tries to paint this. The other thing we see is that Poe uses highlights literal darkness, as all the events in the story occur in the dark of night. But he also, through it, shows us the dark recesses of the human heart and what it is capable of. You can see the quote there, where it's a boastful rant that shows the depraved narrator and proves that the human heart is very dark, and to complement the physical darkness in which the narrator is working his evil deeds. And so the next one would be the literal darkness. All the events in the story occur in physical darkness, and even the officers who come to investigate arrive at 4 a.m. and it is as dark as midnight, I quote. And on the night he commits the murder, he says his room was as dark as pitch, with thick darkness. So you can see it was really dark. It is also interesting to note that the old man was closing his shutters due to the fear of robbers, yet his door is somehow left unlocked all these nights, unless perhaps the narrator is someone who the old man trusts, or maybe a family member, perhaps, they could have been related, even though we don't see that in the story. But it's interesting, the irony of shutting the shutters to prevent robbers, but yet leave the door open, through which the murderer comes in and kills him. Excuse me. So in closing, let me mention that also the title of the story, The Telltale Heart, is very significant, because breaking it down, it's a heart that tells a tale, and the tale to be told here is what really transpired. So the old man's heart, even though it's not the actual one that was beaten at the end of the story, actually leads the narrator to tell or to confess to the crime. And so, in my opinion, it was the guilt within the narrator's own heart that was gnawing at him and could not let him have peace until he owned up to the crime that he had committed. So again, this expounds on my point above about the theme of the story, on the effect of guilt on the human conscience. So, because we see at the very end, the narrator could not live with it, and the heart becomes, comes to the front, like it sounded like the old man's heart is beating, from the floor. And actually, the narrator thought the officers were actually hearing it and mocking him, but really it was on his conscience, the guilt and for what he had done. And it is a very good story. If you haven't read it, I recommend you go ahead and read it. Poe is an interesting author, and he is misunderstood a lot. But after reading most of his, or a few of his work, I think he was a mad genius. He could have been insane. I don't know, but he is really interesting to read, and I recommend everybody takes a look at Poe. Thank you for listening. That's all I have. I've run out of time, and it was a joy, taking this class with you guys and having Dr. Monti as an instructor. It was a great class. I would recommend it to others too. Thank you very much. Here is a short summary. You may pause to read it. And here are my works cited. Thank you.